It's now a well-known fact, and it's been said for year after year after year by prime ministers, by ministers, by officials, that the Muslim charitable sector in the UK is one of the most thriving, is the most often said generous, is the most giving, it's the most dynamic and active. And the numbers of Muslim charities, and we're talking here about an array of organizations starting from schools and mosques and Islamic centers and all the way to charitable and aid and relief organizations. I mean, the sector is vast, it's huge. And the amounts of money that we hear every single year amount to the tens of billions. And obviously in any civil society, the charitable sector is one of the most vital and crucial. But particularly in this case, and in this particular time of the life of the Muslim community here in Britain. And you know, you're in London because of a conference, of a getting together of various charities. I know for a fact that there are people coming also from Europe and from the United States also to take part. It would be a useful exercise to describe, when we're talking about the Muslim charity sector, and before we come to the challenges and difficulties, what are we talking about exactly? What's the size of what we're talking about? What is the impact of this particular sector on British life?
I think one of the issues that we have is actually nobody's really mapped the size of the charity sector. I mean, we looked at it from the Ayaan Institute. We did a report, and we found just for international charity, UK charities, Muslim charities that work international, we found 1,026. Now, I was shocked because I was expecting a few hundred. And since that report, which was earlier this year, I'm finding 40, 50, 60 every day more charities that I've never heard of. Yesterday I was at this conference and people coming to talk to me, giving me their cards. I'd never heard of some of these charities. So it's vastly greater than that. And that's just the international charities. We have mosques, mosque-based charities. We know there are 2,700 mosques and prayer houses. And then we have charities that are UK-based that do service-type work or, you know, specialist needs in the UK, and nobody's ever mapped that. And, you know, we know that's an enormous. So I'd say you were looking at.
You know, in the course, it's funny you mentioned this, because in the course of this particular program, I've come across, you know, individuals, people who work in the charitable sector on things that I never thought, I never contemplated that this was also. I mean, for instance, abuse victims, victims of domestic abuse, mental health issues. You know, and all of this is within a sector which we take immense pride in, which we hear time and again from the government that is doing so fantastically well, but we know very, very little of.
And absolutely, and we, you know, from our experience of local government and working in local government, we know there are loads of community centres, there are other types of youth charities, so it's massive. The issue we have is a lot of charities, the Charity Commission database doesn't record by either religion or faith, and a lot of charities don't have Muslim names.
Yes.
So
correct.
there's actually, you know, you can't. But just to show you how that's growing, I mean, if I tell you how many charities I'm registering at the moment, or got in my books that we're registering, that's 12. Wow. And that's young people, volunteers. I registered a Afghan women's charity. 3 women. There's another women's charity. You know, I'm registering mosques. So, and the inquiries I get, I've had an inquiry this morning before I got here about registering charities. And these are often people who are already working or doing work but have not got to the stage of registering as a charity. So the charitable sector is huge. We at Ayaan, the figures that we managed to get from the Charity Commission, the income of the charities working internationally was in 2021 was 708 million.
Wow.
And the amazing thing is, within the year they spent 611 million, which that takes some energy and effort. And in that sector, there are 10,000 volunteers, around 4,000 trustees, 4,000 staff. That's just in that sector alone. Now, if you add to that the income of the mosques and the UK-based charities, it doesn't take a genius to work out that that's more than £1 billion. And if you look at the population growth of the Muslim population, the forecast to 2050, which we did a projection, and how the sector has been, the money being donated is increasing year on year, we put a conservative estimate of around 20%, and by 2050 we're looking at £4 billion. And that's purely because youngsters are growing up, more women are working, so income's increasing, and of course the tragedies in the Muslim Ummah are great, and the need is great.
Which raises the first issue that's, I think that, well, at least myself, but I think that many people watching this will also be interested in, that is that out of the billion, out of the projected 4 billion in a few years' time, how much of that will go to the development of either the Muslim community or British society? It will be reinvested within society, within our communities. And how much of that will leave our shores to go in order to support and to help and to assist people in need? And obviously that's a very, fair call. I don't think that anyone would argue that someone who has the capacity to sponsor an orphan in Pakistan, for instance, or build a well in Ghana, or to help refugees in various places, I don't think that anyone would argue against that. But the question of the percentage always comes up. So out of that billion in your estimate, maybe even your figures that you've analyzed, how much of that stays and how much of that leaves?
I think there are already lots of charities working in the UK. We probably haven't been able to map it and show how much. So I think it's probably significant already. I mean, the mosques are all in the UK.
Yeah.
Community centres are all in the UK, schools, Islamic schools. So we're already putting a lot of investment. But I think, this idea that you should either, that we live here, we should invest here, whilst I understand that, sometimes it comes from the far right, that, look, they're sending their money overseas, and we shouldn't have that distinction. Muslims will, as any other community, I mean, we have Christian charities who, spend money overseas. We have, non-secular charities who will do work. Human beings will always give to where there is need. And we shouldn't have an expectation that we should do more here if we're not good citizens, if we're doing less here.
And it's not an either or.
It's not an either or. So I think both will continue. It will largely depend on how the Muslim world takes shape, the development in the Muslim world, and the wars and the conflicts. If they stop, of course we will have more income to spend here on things that we want to do. So I don't think we should get into how much, my experience from the charity community sector and local government, where there's a need, human beings will do and set up charitable work to meet that need. I mean, this country is a beautiful and prime example of, the faith-based charities and philanthropy long before the welfare state. Yeah. They were the architects of that, churches and, the Quakers, if you look at that movement. So Muslims, it's part of our deen. Yeah. So we will naturally do that anyway. It might be schools are a priority. We might start funding other things, youth work. I mean, counselling is one. At the moment, we don't have enough counselling. But we do need to do that strategic work, some of us, to show what areas are lacking.
You're absolutely right, because you do get a sense sometimes, and once again, this is an impression rather than any kind of analysis or study, but you sense sometimes that there's a lot of overlapping and there's a lot of duplication of the same efforts. When you find, for instance, 10 charities, major charities, we're not talking about very small, dealing in the thousands or tens of thousands. We're talking about the charities that are dealing, hopefully, in the hundreds of thousands, probably even millions. All, for instance, doing something for Syria. Of course, you realize that the calamity is so vast that it takes not only 10 charities, it needs 100 charities, probably even several governments also to pile in order to sort of appease that kind of, or alleviate that kind of issue. And we're not talking here about politics, because that's a different thing. But there is that kind of sense that there is a lot of duplication on one level, and there's quite a vacuum on many other levels. Like I said, for instance, when I heard that there was a home for abused wives, I've only heard, doing the research, I only knew of 3 organizations, when maybe we need at least 10 more, at least, if not even greater than that. Victims of domestic violence, for instance, people with mental health issues, disabled kids, sports clubs. That's a sector where Muslims are heavily involved, but maybe not to the extent that we actually need and require, especially in cities where children, young people are vulnerable to gangs and to crime and the like. So there's that. But I'd also like to hear from you regarding, over the past few years, we've heard more and more about the Charity Commission and about difficulties posed by the Charity Commission. Obviously, before that, we had Prevent, and how Prevent sort of saw its way into the structure and the very body of the Muslim charitable sector, and got involved with some of those clubs and some of those charities. And somehow now it's very difficult to extract, Prevent, or to try to separate them as a policy from many of the charities. So these are some of the issues that are often discussed whenever talking about the Muslim charitable sector.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the impact one, because I think before we go on to the Charity Commission, because you've raised that, competition, and you're right, a lot of charities are doing the same thing, even internationally. Everybody's doing food aid. And we know food aid is needed, but we need to be a bit more strategic. It's the easiest ask. People who are starving in camps, that's an emotional picture, helps your fundraising. But, even in Syria, we could have done a lot more. I was on the border, I've been to some of the hospitals, and, children who've been hit by a barrel, piece of shrapnel, and they're paralyzed the body down, head down. Only the head works, the rest of the body is paralysed. Now, if we'd put more thought, if we'd had a strategy, we could have provided protective clothing.
Yeah.
Nobody did that.
Yeah.
We could have taught people how to avoid these scenarios, what to do. Nobody did that. I mean, Libya's another one. Over the last decade, I've had people in Libya saying, can you get charities to work in Libya? We need artificial limbs. We're buying them from Europe and they are basically charging us the earth. Mm. Can some charity fund a factory to build artificial limbs? And of course, hardly any charities worked in Libya. You have the Libyan floods and all of a sudden everybody's saying we're on the ground in Libya and they're fundraising. So I think we do need to think about impact, the same with mosques, the same with schools. Do we all need to be doing the same thing? Is there something that we can do? Are there other needs that are being neglected? Women's needs, particularly overseas, widely neglected on the ground. Women and children are the biggest victims in refugee camps, and yet there's not enough attention paid to the needs of women, primarily because the sector is male-dominated and women are not part of the project design. Regarding the Charity Commission, I think certainly the war on terror brought a counter-terrorism climate around the world. You mentioned that, and Muslims began to be seen through the lens of extremism and terrorism, even their charities. And then you have, it's certainly one of the challenges. Muslim charities work in a hostile environment. Sometimes the states that they're working in want to close them down. They don't. And then you have Islamophobic groups in the UK, you have hostile media, all reporting, and then you have a state which is looking for terrorism threats everywhere. And I think that fed through into the Charity Commission's work. I think it did, certainly under Shawcross, I think it became sort of from a regulatory body, it became a bit more of a policing body. But I think that has calmed down, that's changing. And I think it's a learning curve as well for the Charity Commission. What I would say is that the Charity Commission, if somebody's reporting that this charity is funding terrorism or doing that, they're going to investigate. So it's not always the Charity Commission that is the sort of architect. If different governments or lobbies are pestering the Charity Commission or politicians or the media reporting, then they have to go in. And of course, Muslim charities work in high-risk areas.
They do.
We come from countries that are war-torn or having all kinds of political, economic, civil crisis. So they're considered high risk. But I think what I would say is we hear all the stories about charities. Given the number of charities that there are, the Charity Commission has probably never been near most of the charities. I mean, certainly the clients that I deal with, yes, they are being investigated, but equally I've got a lot of charities who have never seen the Charity Commission in 30, 40 years. So we need to perhaps have a bit of balance to that. It was a learning curve for, I guess, Charity Commission officers, learning about the hostile think tanks out there, the hostile groups, the hostile reporting, and that not all of it is true. But I would say that we still have in this country, the charities, the regulation is important, and we still have a light touch regulatory body. I mean, how many charities have been closed down?
Yeah.
Hardly any, I would say, a handful. So there was an environment, and the Charity Commission had to learn how to deal with that, and we also had to learn how to deal with that.
How? I mean, one of the things that you were interested in, and probably even spoke of at the conference, is the issue of governance. And obviously this is something that has to do with these charities internally. Now, we might realize or know that transparency, for instance, and proper accounting and proper dealing with funds and achieving the objectives declared by the charity, all of these things, they make sense. They're not really that difficult to understand and comprehend. But the issue of governance, as I am assuredly told by experts within the field, is an issue within the Muslim charitable sector. If you could tell us just a little bit about that.
Yes, I think it's definitely an issue. You have to, I think, when I was in local government, we funded lots of businesses and regeneration projects and community projects. And there was always the historical sort of view was that there's a voluntary and community sector, and there's the public sector, the professional sector. And the standards expected of each were different, because in the charity and voluntary sector, you had a lot of volunteers, people who were giving their time voluntarily, their effort, doing good works. So it was about building their capacity and learning. I think that's changed with the regulatory burdens, which is a real challenge for charities. Charities are now expected to be more professional. So it's as a local government would be, or the private sector would be. So the burden of regulation is much greater, the requirement for paperwork and things that they've never done before. Risk management. Yeah. I mean, it's second nature to me because I worked in a sector where I had to do that. But even if you've got policies, it requires a cultural shift and a change. Filling in paperwork, making sure that you can demonstrate that you are regulatory compliant with regulation. It's a hard ask for people. And it's not just the Charity Commission. Banks, counter-terrorism, safeguarding. So there's a lot of paperwork, health and safety that charities are basically having to do. And a lot of them don't have a lot of staff. Yeah. Or, that's an issue in itself. They have the attitude that the more you save on staff, the more of your money's going to... Well, you can't do that anymore. So there's a whole change in expectations, and that puts a great burden. And yes, there's a lot of bad governance out there, but we have to build the capacity of those groups. I mean, we do some things very poorly. Yeah. Conflict of interest, for instance, and loyalty. We are not really good at that, and sometimes we don't even take it that seriously. Yeah. We get a lot of issues like that. We have a wider political environment. We're not very good at managing risk. We have volunteers who work overseas. At the moment, Gaza, people are very emotional. Yeah. Naturally, they're going to say things. So trustees and charities are having to do different things, manage social media, manage, the hostile people actually going through the 40 years of tweets to see if this person is an anti-Semite or racist or anti-LGBT. So the environment that we work in is different, and as I say, it's still primarily board members or volunteers. We have some staff, but there's thousands of volunteers. It's still a voluntary-led sector. So there's a lot of issues, and banking is another one. I mean, the banking...
Yeah, I mean, this is something that obviously I know about, but it appears to be something that the charitable sector, and particularly the Muslim charitable sector, has also been facing, with many preferring not to speak out and not to talk. Firstly, a fear that their secondary bank accounts might be subsequently closed down. And obviously because of issues of trust with their donors, with their sponsors, with their backers. When you hear of a particular organization whom you're volunteering for or donating to, having their bank accounts closed, that's not a good thing, definitely.
Yes, and as I say, sometimes the requirement for paperwork from the bank and the questions. I mean, I just had somebody on the phone this morning about the questions that were being asked. It's actually, and I see the letters. It's actually much more onerous than the Charity Commission. So this is another level, and certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, all my clients that I've dealt with have had banking issues, and that's a lot. So I've seen the letters, and it's bank de-risking. I mean, this started 15 years ago when the US imposed a fine on, I can't remember which bank it was, Barclays or HSBC, I'm not sure, a massive fine, and a process of de-risking started to take place where ended up being no risking. Yeah. And the banks started doing these risk assessments, and instead of looking for risks of terrorism and money laundering, they started looking at newspaper reporting of what's in the newspapers about you, what you've said, and taken that as a sign of extremism or risk of extremism and terrorism. And of course, Muslims are working in those high-risk countries, so we're disproportionately affected. But having said that, it's not exclusive to Muslim charities. I know sometimes we think it is, but the non-Muslim charity sector suffers from it. Ordinary individuals, poor people, people from conflicts, Syrian community, and even ordinary individuals. Might not be your charity, but your personal account, as you know. So I think this is a society-wide issue, and what I said yesterday was that as we move towards a cashless society, banking, having a bank account, if you don't have one, you're financially excluded. You're excluded from life. So this should be considered a human right, and we should have a guaranteed right to a bank account, including for civil society groups, because you can't operate as a charity or a civil society group if you don't have a bank account.
I mean, if there's an agreement, even if an overarching, very general and broad agreement on this, which makes absolute sense, I mean, what you've just said, the charitable sector, Muslim and none, as you put it, there are many, many non-Muslim charities and individuals as well who are suffering as a result of this. I mean, this sector that is worth tens of billions to the British economy every single year surely has lobbying power. How come this very sensible line is not pushed on decision makers and is not, made something of a call?
This is the surprising thing, because we sit and talk about it when charities are being investigated with the Charity Commission. They understand it. They explain it's nothing to do with them. It's a banking decision. They know it's a wider issue. I know that. I've raised it with Muslim groups, and wider society knows that. There are financial conduct reports on it. And you know what? It took Nigel Farage
Incredible.
It's probably, things work in mysterious ways. It took a man like Nigel Farage to raise this issue. And now that it is there, I think we have to make our voice known that this is a society-wide issue. We can't allow this kind of deprivation taking place. We must have a right to a bank account, and we must be able to challenge some of the risk assessments that they do. I've seen some of the risk assessments, or I get an idea of what they're doing. And sometimes the people doing them, quite frankly, either they use software, which basically says, Anas Altikriti said this on such a day, and that's a risk, and therefore we're not taking risk. Or, they've done a risk assessment. Nigel Farage, again, I don't know how he's done this because we've never been able to, but he's managed to get his risk assessment out in the public. And we can now see what happens, people's political views, etc. And it's not actually an assessment. As I say, as somebody who knows about risk management, they're not managing the risk.
Yes.
They're not even assessing it properly.
Yeah.
Is he a risk on money laundering and terrorism, despite all that information? So some of the risk assessments are very poor. So there has to be a standard, there has to be a right to challenge that information. And of course, banks need to do money laundering checks, and they do need to do some risk assessment, particularly politically exposed people or PEPs, like Nigel Farage. I know he's made a big fuss about it, but I think it's perfectly right that politicians in particular from this country and overseas, where there's so much corruption and money being transferred, are scrutinised and monitored and considered.
You see, this is the thing, Jahangir. I hail from Iraq, and it gives me no pleasure to state that for the past 20 years since the invasion and occupation of Iraq, Iraq is one of the most failed countries in the world. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I believe that the 2021 list by Transparency International placed Iraq just slightly better than war-torn countries, like Syria and Yemen and the like. An oil-rich country, probably one of the richest countries in the world in terms of its oil revenues, reduced to rubble. And yes, obviously, the invasion and occupation were elementary and instrumental in reducing the country to such. But also, you have the ruling elites and the ruling class who siphoned billions, literally billions. We're talking about a GDP of probably over 100 billion every single year, with slightly over 10 billion delivered in terms of services to the public. So you ask the question, yes, of course, transparency and proper governance are important. But going after individuals and organizations, I'll make it personal here, like myself. And then you hear about millions traveling between accounts freely and without accountability, people whom in which world they live, in what dealings they do, and then having mansions in the most affluent quarters of London, for instance, or Paris or the like. And you think to yourself, hang on, if there's really this stringent monitoring by banks, surely, those who are in power, in offices of influence in countries like Iraq, but obviously not exclusively to Iraq. Pakistan is another example. It just doesn't make sense. There is something that is wrong.
You're absolutely right. We had the example of Russian oligarchs.
Yeah.
They only became a problem
after the war.
After the war, but we've known for a long time
Absolutely.
that they had masses of wealth in London. We know about Pakistani politicians, Azerbaijan, even Indian politicians. So there does seem to be a certain set of standards. Maybe, I don't know if there's a limit on the amount you have to have before. If you have an amount that's less, maybe you're at risk. And if you have an amount in your account. So I think there is a serious issue. And of course, at the think tank that I work on, that's one of the issues, corruption, that we're looking at. Because it's a major drain on Muslim countries and it impoverishes them. And we have to deal with it, and we have to ensure that banks deal with that problem, not the small civil society group that, somebody may have said something inappropriate at some stage, and that's considered, some kind of high risk. But there is a general environment as well in most countries where civil society and civil activism space is being reduced. We're getting oligarchs and elites who are embedded in political systems, and their interests dominate. And obviously, they pressurize governments on laws and. Some of our protest laws that we've had and other laws. So that space is shrinking. So the civil society, not just charitable, but the advocacy sector, we have to protect that, because that's one of the things that made this country what it is. The right to, sometimes governments talk as if they're champions of freedom of speech. It wasn't governments that gave in Europe freedom of speech. It was people on the ground, the activists, those who challenged the system, and we shouldn't allow government to, close that space.
A couple of years back, there was, actually, I think it was last year, 2022, when there was quite an expansive report on Muslim civil society. And the thing that you get from flipping through that quite bulky report is the fact that we're talking about a vast section. We're talking about a sector that employs tens of thousands of people, that covers all areas of public life, and that benefits the entire country. And in the case of various sectors of the charitable sector, particularly, even beyond Britain. But what does it take for British Muslims to recognize their imprint, their actual impact on British society? I mean, the dominant narrative still seems to cite particularly Muslims, but not exclusively Muslims. I mean, Asians, Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, as being outsiders, as being leeches on society. There is that kind of narrative which you can sense, and which triggers, the kind of racist narrative that we catch the glimpses of from time to time. How can you go on about educating young Muslims to be proud of the kind of effort that has been exerted by their fathers, grandfathers, even great-grandfathers on this country that has brought the kind of reality that we have today?
Rather than look without, I like to look within sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think whilst we have this great sector, it's the point that you made earlier about doing similar things. And maybe, some of the grant funders that I met, Muslim business people yesterday, they're saying, look, we give grants, we give money, but actually we don't know if it's any use, because there's no strategy, there's no strategic thinking. We don't know if this is making a difference. So what we have is an imbalance, I would say. Putting my policy and think tank and local government experience together, we've created some brilliant institutions. We've got a great institutional framework. We haven't created other things that we thought are important, or we didn't realise were important, such as challenging racism, such as challenging Islamophobia. I mean, if you were to look at organisations we have who do that, there's very few. So we don't have the political groups, the advocacy groups, and charities can't get involved in politics. So there's an imbalance, and maybe we need to move towards more of those type of groups. And some of those can be charities. Challenging racism can be registered as charities, challenging Islamophobia. And maybe we've also put our hat too much into the Labour Party and the Tory Party or whatever, and not developed independent frameworks, community organisation and mobilisation. And we've also developed the thinking of the race relations industry, where it's, in a way, everybody's fighting for who's the most deprived or claiming who's the most deprived. Now, this is the wrong approach, in my opinion, and something we're trying to change at Ayaan. If you're constantly pleading poverty, weakness, victimhood, and not selling your strengths and your power, how much you contribute to this society, which we don't, even our charities, all the great work, nobody promotes that really, then you're not going to have much respect. I mean, speaking frankly, nobody really cares for the poor and the impoverished. And that's how we've presented ourselves. As people who are, coming here because we're poor, we're earning money, and we're not, we're a drain on this country. We're not an asset. And I think that has to change. And we have to challenge those images and stereotypes, but we have to create, our own strategic approach, and not, if it's the Labour Party saying, this group is deprived. I was in Oldham, a friend's house, and Oldham is one of the most, Oldham, Rochdale, the north of England, some of the, wealthy, most deprived areas. 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, if you went to Oldham, there's still deprivation, but I was having dinner at a friend's house, and he said, everyone on this street, that I know them all, everyone's son and daughters are at university. Most of the streets around, their sons and daughters are going to university now. So these are all positives. There's a change. There's a sea change.
And the fact that he's noting it. Means that he comes from a time when that was barely there.
We remember that, and now we see it. We see young kids most Muslim children are now getting into education. You go to a place like Manchester, Bradford, we've changed the shape of this country. We've got businesses are flourishing, we've got female businesses, male businesses. We've transformed the landscape of this country, but we're not very good at telling our story.
Telling the story,
and promoting how that is a strength. And I think we need to do more of that, and we need to have charities and groups that do more of that work.
You touched very, very briefly on something which I want to expand on a little bit more, and that is the relationship between the Muslim community in the charitable sector particularly and government. And obviously we are in very dynamic, let's call them dynamic political times, whilst the elections are due towards the end of next year, but it is very, very possible that they may happen earlier. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but we are now hearing, the kind of sound bites from all politicians that are usually synonymous with times of electioneering. And this brings about something that you've mentioned. The vast majority of the Muslim community has traditionally thrown its hat in the Labour circle. And to all intents and purposes, and according to all polling surveys and the like, it seems that we are going to end up with a Labour government after the next general election. How can you regulate the relationship between the charitable sector and authority? I mean, you spoke about the link, which is a weak one and needs to be strengthened, of advocacy and pressuring and the like. But more to the point, the relationship between the Muslim community and the various governments, regardless of whether it be conservative that we've had since 2010, or a coming Labour government. How do you regulate for that? How do you legislate for that particular relationship? What kind of relationship do we have? What kind of relationship do we need? What kind of relationship can we expect in light of what's happening here as well as abroad?
I think we need to think this through, perhaps differently than in the past. One, I think we definitely don't project how much we contribute to this country for politicians to take us seriously. And that's the first. We are not organised independently. A lot of our mosques organisations are people who are Labour Party members. Yeah. So that it's a conflict of interest. That kind of linkage prevents an independent approach, a strategy that we should have. I'm not saying don't get involved in that, although even there I think we might have to rethink that. I mean, certainly at the moment we have a situation where effectively if you're in the Labour Party, you're in a prison. You can't speak out. If you're in the Conservative Party, you're in a prison. But, we're going to be 10% of the population as a minimum by 2050. Yeah. What is wrong with Muslims? I know we've tried in the past, but maybe differently. What is wrong with Muslims standing as independents?
Yeah.
If you have enough business people and
why are we trapped between this kind of binary decision, either Conservatives or Labour, with a very, very few going to the why is that?
I think because we've been convinced that you have to get to power and you have to be in a party that's going to get power to make change. Now, that's not how change has happened in this country. First of all, change in this country, the great changes we had always happened, or the momentum for change happened outside, in movements, in organisations, in civil society, in sectors, even, women's rights, even the LGBT rights, all these things happened outside. The Labour Party itself,
correct,
it was a Labour movement.
Correct.
So we are not out there challenging. We are becoming part of a existing system where you can't challenge. So we have to have that approach as well. And I think once you have that, we need to be able to speak out. We can't change if you can't speak. So we have to have other approaches. Unfortunately, our parents came as migrant workers, and Labour was a party of the labourers. The world has changed. Labour is a party of high finance, of elite interest. It doesn't even represent the voters of this country anymore. And we can be a great voice, not just for, I'm not saying as a minority, because that's how Labour sees us. There's a Muslim MP, we use them to get the Muslim vote, and that's what they're there for. No, we're here as change makers to this society.
Nice.
You know, why don't we should be leading this call for, you know, a banking right, because poor people can't get bank accounts.
Absolutely.
And if we had independent politicians, an independent political approach, people maybe even, you know, certainly as councillors, as party members.
And surely, I mean, because I speak with my neighbours, I speak with my colleagues, and they come from various backgrounds. And I have to say that there is a very clear, discernible air of desperation. The fact that we don't have a choice. The fact is that regardless of whether we have a Labour or a Tory, it's going to be the same. Which opens the door for exactly what you're saying, especially that I believe that, the kind of sector that we talked about, whether it be the charitable sector or the Muslim civil society sector, surely we have something to say about the NHS. Surely we have something to speak about, the transport system, about how public funds are being allocated, how students and education. Surely we have something to say on those. So in a way, I mean, what you just said is something which needs to be extrapolated and then done in sort of an executive plan on behalf of that sector, as to, okay, so what is it that we have to say in regards with the crises that are strangulating the country and are preventing it from achieving the kind of economic, social, political security heights that, potentially are there.
There's a whole scope of things where Muslims, with their ethics and values, have will have an appeal in wider society. The way the poor are treated, the emphasis on the rich, coexistence, anti-supremacy.
Yeah.
Muslims cannot accept, the racial supremacy of any group.
Absolutely.
So we have to, and we can only project those things independently. I mean, you can't even fly a Palestinian flag in the Labour Party. I mean, what is the point of a Muslim being in a political party if you can't speak and you can't even show a flag, and you can't challenge any of the elites? But that breaking of the link of traditional democracy of the parties, those in power, and the people is very big. And I think, I do think, and we have plenty of good spokespeople, independents who could have a wider appeal than Muslims and win elections. And you're one of them.
I get to meet hordes of young Muslim men and women in all spheres of life. And I have to say that I am often, dumbstruck by how brilliant they are. Yeah. What kind of minds they carry, what kind of potential they have, to think, to project an intellectual idea that solves, something of a mundane nature, like the issue of poverty at a time of the economic crisis that we have. And it hurts me how we're not utilizing, and these voices are lost on society as a whole. It doesn't matter, ultimately speaking, if I want my kids to go to a good school and receive a proper, sound education, I must hope for the same for everyone's kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the same with the NHS, the same with public transport. I can't just be comfortable in my own seat on the tube. Everyone has to be comfortable. And that kind of thinking, that kind of potential is there, but it's not used
because
properly.
we're not really, as I say, the potential is there in the Muslim community and in wider society. Yeah. But what we're doing is when we're telling them that your only approach is this, go to a political party,
Yeah.
you're actually sending them in a prison which is going to destroy the town. We have people doing rap, we have poetry, we have people who are, all kinds of political activists. I mean, if somebody came to me with that kind of talent, the last place I would send them is a political
party.
because it's like a death sentence. You're going to be in chains the rest of your life. So I think we, as a community, we're long overdue a strategic rethink on how we do things, and we have resources to play with. We have institutions. We've established an institutional framework. We're familiar with our environment now. We know what it looks like, and we need to map a road for the future. And I think we have some really bright prospects. Of course, it's looking very grim at the moment, but the passion that you see at the moment, despite an overburdened response to what's happening in the Muslim world, the energy, the resoluteness not to be, oppressed and silenced, I think, that's a great story.
Of course.